of as our Growing as a Community, Foundations of Anti-Racism. My name is Mercedes Piedra, and I'm one of the directors in the Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the Sacramento campus at UC Davis Health. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists that we're going to be talking about some of the challenges that we've incurred in 2020 and have entered into 2021 again. And so, but before we start, what we like to do is get everybody centered by just doing a short breathing exercise, and I'll guide you through that breathing exercise. And so as we're getting ready to center ourselves, what we want to do is, you don't have to close your eyes, you could just drop your gaze, but I'd like everyone to take one hand, it could be your left hand or your right hand, and you're gonna put it over your heart. And that helps us to connect with our body and get us centered. And so we're just going to take 3 cleansing breaths through our nose, breathing out through our mouth. And I'll start that process with you now. So take a deep breath through your nose. Hold it for a second and release out of your mouth. Going to take the second one through your nose. Hold it for a second, release. And our last breath together through your nose. And release. Get the busyness of the morning aside so we can be open, heart, mind, body, and soul, for all the great information we're going to be sharing. So the Growing as a Community sessions, we always like to see and have our participants go ahead and populate the chat through the session. What we'd like to ask right now is, how are you showing up right now? So in the chat, feel free to just put how you're coming into the room after this wonderfully long weekend. Anything that's on your heart or mind, go ahead and put the chat in so that we can once again build the community that we're here for. In addition to, throughout the session, the chat is open, so you can ask questions, share resources, and this is a way for us to lean into the wisdom of the community, because as we started the session, we didn't always know every perfect way to do things. There's no perfection here. It's all about acceptance. It's all about everyone's psychological and spiritual and holistic safety in this space. So we'll have the chat open, we'll ask a few questions, and we're going to get started with our session. So our panelists today are our very own Dr. Piri Ackerman Barger, who is the Associate Dean for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and here at the UC Davis Betty Irene Moore School of Nursing. Dr. Jan Murray Garcia, who is Associate Clinical Professor, Associate Clinical Professor, also for the School of Nursing. And then Victoria Nago. Dr. Nago is here also as a postdoctoral scholar who is helping out Dr. Jan Murray Garcia with all of the wonderful research and trainings and everything possible in her specialization. And all of these individuals are here today. So welcome to our panelists. And we're just going to have a dialogue on some questions. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Piri Ackerman Barger. With everything that we've experienced through 2020, definitely racism and the social unrest since the death of George Floyd, all the way up until January 6th when the insurgents of the Capitol came about. We're in historic times. And so why is it important historically to lift up anti-racism, and also why is it important to our healthcare?
Yeah, Mercedes, thank you for that question. And I think that there are multiple layers to that question that in some ways can make you feel tired or make you feel inspired. I think the tired part of this is that the things that we are seeing today in terms of the outcomes from our institutions. And when I say institutions, I mean things like the institution of healthcare, education, the legal system, even things like employment, have had the same disparate outcomes over time. And so that is not new. And there has been this collective sense of denial about that. Like we've heard so many people say, just the memes like on Facebook and social media that, nobody alive today is a slave and nobody alive today is a slave owner. So why do we keep going back to that? And that is a sense of, this fatigue in having this conversation. Yet when the outcomes are not changing, that means that we need to continue that conversation, even if it does feel fatiguing. And we see that we continue to live the legacy of our history. It's not like it just goes away and lives in a textbook. It continues to live in our culture and our way of thinking, as Dr. Murray Garcia talks about in our scripts about ourselves and each other. And to quote Ziggy Marley, if you don't know your past, you don't know your future. So how can you possibly plan for a future that has health equity or equity within all our institutions if we don't understand the processes that have gotten us here? Another person I'd like to quote is Sean King, and he talks about the ebbs and flows. He talks about dips in history, and that there are these predictable times of great justice and great awakening, and then these times where we dip deeply. And so if we look at history, we can understand that, I love what Martin Luther King Jr. says about, the arc of justice is, going in the right direction. And that may be true, but it's not a straight line. There are the ups and downs of getting there, and we need to understand that so we can do things differently than we've done them before. And so I think it's hard for us as healthcare providers to admit and face our dark past, in terms of what happened decades ago and centuries ago, but also the way that we have been complicit in that. I personally, I'm just going to lay it out there. There are times when I look back on decisions that I've made, judgments that I've made, and I do feel a sense of guilt and shame about that. And it's hard to look at it, but denying it and pretending that I haven't been complicit is not going to help me move forward as a healthcare provider. And I think that that's true of all of us, that we can't really change our past, but we can change the way that we move forward. So I've been working on the social determinants of health class for our upcoming DNP program in the School of Nursing, and have been rereading Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid.
Yes.
Definitely a difficult book to read, but you can start to see some of the correlations between the thought process in healthcare, hundreds of years ago to to now. You can look at James Marion Sims and beliefs about the way that Black people experience pain, which allowed him to justify in his mind just brutal experiments on Black women and neonates. He is lauded with having given us a lot of the knowledge that we have about vesiculovaginal repair. For people that don't know what that is, that's during childbirth, when that layer of skin between the vagina and the rectum, that part that separates those two, rips. And so he was in there cauterizing, suturing, scraping without anesthesia, even though that was available during his day. And so that notion about the way that Black people experience pain still exists in the way that that people view pain now. I mean, there's a study that came out in 2016 that shows that there were medical students and residents who believed that the nerve endings of Black people were less sensitive than white people. There was a textbook that was taken off the market. It was a nursing textbook that had stereotypes about how different people experience pain, that Black people tended to exaggerate their pain. And of course, if you think that they feel less pain, yet they're expressing pain, they must be exaggerating it, right? Jewish people are so demanding about their, their needs around pain, just all of these awful stereotypes that have been around for a long time. And then we wonder about these outcomes that we see over and over. Maternal health care. We look at the disparities back, again, James Marion Sims, and then we look at this continued disparity experienced by Black women and Native American women in terms of maternal health outcomes. And then again, looking at mental health. We, and when I say we, I am saying we as a healthcare system, as an institution, atrocities in terms of mental health care, calling people who were enslaved, having a mental illness called drapetomania if they wanted to get away from their torturers and their captors. That was considered mental illness. The idea that switched from women being crazy for not wanting to be housewives, and that morphed into Black people being schizophrenic because they thought that white people were out to get them. Meanwhile, there's lynchings happening and, peaceful protests where, folks like John Lewis were beat in the head. It's like, this is not paranoia. This is actually happening on our television sets. And then we look at these huge disparities, like why don't Black people want to come in and get mental health care? And people say, oh, they're just worried about stigma, cultural stigma. It might be about trust. Like, I don't trust you to take care of me in this way. And, a lot of healthcare providers are genuinely perplexed. Like, why wouldn't you want to come? And it's like, you would know the answer to that if you understood our history. And, all of my examples have focused on Black people, but I want you to know that it's not just Black people that have experienced these disparities. It's folks from the LGBTQ plus community. It's women, it's Native Americans, Hispanics. I mean, we can go on, disabled people who are grappling with mental health issues. So if we're going to change our outcomes, we need to know what got us here. And then we need to think differently about how we're going to move forward.
Thank you, Perry. In the complacency for everyone during these times, wanting to lift up the need for the education, but the information's always been there. We just have to Google and have that intentionality to get more information to be able to move forward. I heard one speaker this weekend saying today's complacency is tomorrow's captivity, meaning the history once again freezing us, and now where do we go? I also remember in the School of Nursing when I was with you all, we would have the students read Martin Buber's I Thou book about the importance of the relationship and the importance of seeing people as human, right? And if not, we come into an I-it relationship. And if we objectify folks, then we don't put in the effort for the humanity that needs to happen. The book that you lifted up was Medical Apartheid. Everyone should read it. Difficult reading, but really shows the history of where we've been, especially in medicine. And so moving forward, really wanting to lift up with Dr. Jan Marie Garcia, the foundations of racism. We all lose in racism. And also our majority group, they're losing quite a bit also. So wanting to turn it to Dr. Jan Marie Garcia about racism in our society historically and moving forward.
Thank you, Mercedes. Thank you, Puri. Incredible summary. What's up, everybody? So good to see so many of you that I've known from long ago and more recently. Incredible times, right? Incredible times we're living in. And some folks have called it an inflection point. And in the sense that many of us saw this coming, what happened on June 6th, what's been bubbling under the surface, not so far under the surface. And it's hard to not be overwhelmed by it. I think when Melanie Turvalon and I created this concept of cultural humility, it was in contrast to cultural competence, which says you can get a handle on this, you can get a degree in this. It was so mechanistic and like health disparities were a technical problem with a technical solution. And what I want to say today is there are, as Puri said, historical scripts that are hundreds of years old that are still in our brains neurologically, and certainly in the room with patients or students or whoever you work with colleagues. I like to focus a lot on going back and forth between identity and history, because if you look at the history, it's just overwhelming, and we can't fix anything without, and I don't want to say we can fix, these issues are issues of our individual identity and our collective identity. And why is that important? It's not what we know. It's not what we've done. It's not what our cultural resume looks like. It's who are we devoted to becoming? Not even how do I get to be able to, or tell me what to do in the room with this patient or that patient. These are issues, deep issues of identity for us. And so if you haven't read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, Beverly Daniel Tatum introduces the idea of racial identity development theory. And that was a life-changing thing for me, that people aren't racist or not racist, people aren't woke or not woke, that we are all on our own developmental journeys. And so the same events or the same lecture or hit us in different ways, depending on where we are in that developmental trajectory. It's thought in this schema that there's, of course, our identities are multifaceted, but it's thought that white folks have a specific dominant identity that they need to attend to, and that people of color share a coming to terms with the nation's racial hierarchy in very different ways than white folks do. And I've had many people in my audiences say to me, well, I just don't identify with the term white. That's not me. My ancestors are from, and then they'll name a country, which is fabulous. I love ancestry and that history. However, it really doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. Whiteness is a historical phenomenon that precedes us by hundreds of years. And as you can see, is still having consequences for the way we do America together daily. So my different activities at UCDH, UC Davis Health, have been around that, going back and forth between how we're historically scripted and also scripted by our identities, by our exposures to things. And one of the strategies I have intentionally tried to develop was to build the capacity of my institutional community to hold people's developmental processes, if that makes sense. That I'm not going to give you the tool that you need. There's not one lecture that's going to nail it for you. That we're all continually growing, and we're not supposed to do this alone. I had a colleague way back in the 90s who said, I love it, I believe it, now tell me what to do. And not only is that more mechanistic than is even makes sense, but the idea that I expect folks to grow and develop alone into who we need one another to be couldn't be further from the truth. And so one of my strategies with my compatriots here at UC Davis is to build the capacity of our institution to be a space where we can grow as Americans, as colleagues, as providers that really practice anti-racism and anti-homophobia and all of it. So you'll see in whether it's the interprofessional Central Valley road trip, it's as much about relationships as it is visiting the prison and UC Merced and 40 Acres, the first headquarters of the United Farm Workers. Whether it's the Summer Institute on Race and Health or the class Dr. No and I are going to teach in a couple weeks, Race and Health in the United States. It's really trying to build a safe space where we know there are people who aren't going to bite our heads off as we grow, as we make mistakes. And not just white folks making mistakes, although there's a great literature on the psychology of that interracial anxiety or stereotype threat of white folks, that when we begin to interact and be in conversations, sometimes our fear takes over, our fear of fulfilling a stereotype of the racist white person. And it's that fear that undermines our capacity that we take into these encounters. So you underperform, just like women in math or Black folks in IQ tests. That's classically what we think about a stereotype threat. But there's a stereotype threat of, I think, all of us, but certainly white folks, that where we're afraid of making a mistake. And so there's avoidance behavior that has been documented. Even physical space we choose between one another so that we, because we're afraid that it's only a matter of time before people see who we really don't want to be. And I have this issue I've shared before in terms of homophobia and issues of the LGBTQ community. And it's why I work so hard to build communities of dialogue where someone's going to correct my script, someone's going to hear it, someone's going to recognize the script that is so neurologically embedded in me that it's like a fish in water. I would never see it unless one of my dear colleagues or friends pointed out to me. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so the solution becomes partly, how can you build communities within your units? And it doesn't have to be everybody, because it's not going to be everybody, but how can you build these mini communities of dialogue so that you're always learning, and you're learning with folks who know we're always learning, that this is a lifelong issue. I'm going to stop there and we can talk further about it, but whether it's, you'll see we're going to do a book club on jazz and race coming up here in the next couple months with the artist who was with us, Leonor Anthony from Florida, Cuban-American artist. But just whether it's these kind of conversations or other conversations, Are you getting better at hearing those scripts so you can interrupt them so you don't hurt people? Or you don't build a policy that perpetuates an institutional script or a historical script? Okay,
Thanks, Jan.
there we go. There you
And
have it.
in
There
addition
you have it.
to, at the health system, we do have racial healing circles that have now gone virtual since the pandemic. And that's a beautiful place to get proximate and be able to have storytelling and being able to really listen and be proximate to others who are not like you. And as Dr. Jan is saying, being intentional with the community building that we're trying to advance at the health system for the communities we serve. So although we're doing them virtually, we have the racial healing circles, we do have Growing as a Community. This entire week we are having quite a few virtual programs in the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So thank you, Jan. We're going to move over to Dr. Nago. Victoria, so glad that you're here.
You.
And you're doing quite a bit of work with Dr. Jan in the training across our health system, specifically to our executive leaders, to our nurse managers, really being able to get the education for our professionals here at the health system to be better serviced to our colleagues and to the communities we serve. And your emphasis in research, you do quite a bit in research of informatics, but also trying to bring together the discussion of racism with the algorithms that you have found. Can you lift up some of your expertise in this arena?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me here. Hi, everybody. So just to give you a little bit of background, I just spent 2020, and then I'm so lucky to be spending 2021 with Dr. Jan Marie Garcia and actually working with Dean Peary, Ackerman Barger, looking at race and health in the United States. But my background is in healthcare administration, and also for my dissertation, I worked in looking at informatics and how we can use data to make better clinical decision making. And for people that are not aware of what informatics is the science of how we use data, information, and knowledge to improve human health and the delivery of healthcare services. And in the spirit of anti-racism, we were talking about research and what we can, like the types of questions that we're asking is entrenched with I want you to think about the idea that research may not be devoid of racism, and it should be something that we could think about when we talk about eliminating racism in our institution, in our nation, in the world. And especially when we're talking about community-based research, I'd like to explore about how we build our team, how we conduct our, develop our study design, how we recruit our patients, our participants, how we collect the data, how we analyze the data, and how we disseminate this data. I think 2020 was definitely a year to remember. And we started off with COVID-19 and the first case being confirmed in January. And by March, it was declared a national emergency and our nation shut down. And with George Floyd's death at the end of May, it started this national dialogue of what was considered how we can eliminate racism. And a lot of this, and actually even with our insurrection in January, a lot of the decisions, the conversations, as well as what we were basing our thoughts and ideas came from data. So a recent paper that I wrote in November looked at the quality of data, but I want to go into understanding how we develop our teams and what kinds of questions we're asking in terms of what we're trying to pursue as research. So as we develop our team, we got to think about like the research team itself. I'm not saying that there's any right or wrong of who gets funded and what types of research gets funded in the first place, but actually having a longer dialogue of understanding, are there inequities in how we fund our research as a nation, right? And in the reality, I think there was a paper that came out in 2011 that looked at who gets funded in NIH, and minorities are less likely to be funded for the types of research they propose. So Gint et al. In 2011 showed that Black research applicants are 13 percentage points less likely to receive funding from NIH investigator-initiated research funding compared to whites. And that was looking at data from 2000 to 2006. And then in 2019, the same research study was looked at, but they looked at data from 2011 to 2015. And unfortunately, there is inequity there, and Black applicants tend to propose research on topics with lower award rates. Just by topic choice alone, that accounts for 20% of the funding gap after controlling for multiple variables, including the applicant's prior achievements. And the reason why I'm talking about the team itself is because that may affect the way the different studies that are being explored, right? So a lot of the topics that the minoritized investigators are proposing are mainly around community-based research as well as population-based level research, as opposed to the mechanisms of disease itself. And not saying that that is more important versus not important, but I think just having to think about that, like what types of research gets funded. In 2020, when we're talking about study designs, I think we should think about inequitable access that occurs with interventions that are made available through channels that are not equally available to all. And I would say, you know, UC Davis is really amazing at offering telehealth and as an intervention, and we're very, very excited with technology being available to help combat like some of the barriers around access to care. But we also have to think about what that intervention means in terms of having access to this technology. I think a 2015 survey looked at more than 1 in 3 US households headed by a person 65 or older do not have access to a desktop or a laptop, and more than half do not have a smartphone device itself. So while family members or caregivers can help, 1 in 5 Americans older than the age of 50 suffer from social isolation or some other access issue. And so access to technology is also a barrier in other ages and minority groups. When we think about recruitment and clinical trial recruitment in the community, and I think that's why we encourage you to participate in our anti-racism and cultural humility training I'm doing with Dr. Jan and Dean Peary, is that we got to think about like what that means in terms of clinical trial recruitment in the community. There are barriers to translation, literacy, family composition, and severity of like medical diagnoses that were identified. And what that means in terms of who's actually doing the recruitment, how we're actually doing the recruitment. Is it an equitable process itself? And that actually comes down to how we collect the data and how we analyze the data, right? So one of the hot topics right now is what is the role of race in medicine, right? So there's an ongoing debate, and our understanding of race and human genetics has advanced considerably since this topic of race and medicine has been proposed like more than a decade ago. But these insights that haven't led to clear guidelines on how we use race in medicine and the result of the ongoing conflict between the latest insights from population genetics and clinical implementation of race, and where we're inundated by all this data is that we don't necessarily know what that means, right? Because we're not sure how we're defining it as researchers, clinical practitioners, and despite that there's mounting evidence that race is not a reliable proxy for genetic difference, there has been a belief embedded historically, sometimes even in training and in medical practice that we don't necessarily talk about, but which is very exciting. So a paper by Vyas et al. Just came out late last year, well, August of last year, talks about this, and I encourage you to read it, where we do talk about, where they talked about race correction. And I actually like to open up this to Dr. Jan, because she's actually serving on the committee looking at race-based correction in nephrology. Dr. Jan?
Thank you, Victoria. It's just a wonderful case study about UC Davis Health. So Victoria is alluding to something that has been done in medicine for quite a while now to estimate renal failure, kidney failure, how far along you are, when do you need dialysis, when do we put you on the transplant list. And those things have always been racially unequal, meaning Black folks die of kidney failure more, they're less likely to get transplants, they're lately referred to transplant. And this mathematical correction based on one element of kidney function has recently been interrogated, and many schools, University of Washington, UCSF, Harvard, have stopped using it because it's one of these scripts, professional scripts, that ends up in the same inequality year after year after year. I mean, it's personal to me because my brother has kidney failure, and I am always wondering, are they underestimating the severity of his kidney failure with this mathematical correction that's built on muscle mass, on somebody's notion that Black people have more muscle mass than other people, which sounds so racist to me from somebody who's not a nephrologist. But this issue came up in a very community-based way within our health system, in that Dr. Lugatordo, who's an internist, was running just general medicine rounds on Juneteenth. And she stopped to ask her group of trainees, does anybody know about Juneteenth? Who does that, right? So anyway, that student's question led to the nephrology group getting together here at the institution. Again, just, it's not a straight line like Piri says, but in community, we are looking at eliminating that, and whether that's the right thing to do, and what does the national organization think, and all that. So these things are, it's again, like cultural humility. It's not going to be a straight line to see what's wrong, fix it. Racism is so embedded within the way that we do America, including healthcare. It's going to take all of us with different eyes. Why you need a diverse unit workforce, you need a diverse nurse, physician, PA, public health, informatics, for sure, as Victoria is explaining. We're just going to keep doing things the same way and asking the same questions, right?
Right.
So there you have it. Thank you, Victoria, for saying that.
Thank you, Dr. Jan and Dr. Nago. So with the last few minutes we have for our session, really wanting to hear from our panelists about connecting the dots so that we don't continue to perpetuate racism and taking action to disrupt our systems and moving forward with anti-racism. And I'll go to Dr. Ackerman Barger.
Thank you for a really robust discussion thus far. All right, so connecting the dots, getting from where we are to where we want to be. I would suggest that, again, there are levels to this, and we have to talk about systemic inequities, and then in parentheses, I like to say racism because we need to focus on that specifically. And when I think about systemic racism, I think of some subheaders that are structural, institutional, and individual. And at the structural level, we are looking at the laws, the national, state, county policies that that really guide the way that we behave, and a lot of the outcomes that we see. Redlining, for example, would be a notion around structure. It's like a physical structure, but it's also these laws and these practices that have gotten us to this place. When we look at it at the institutional level, Victoria was talking about research and how people are excluded from research. There's a term out there called epistemic exclusion. Epistemic, it refers to epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. So epistemic exclusion means that there are voices that have been systematically silenced and pushed aside in the academy. These are often women, and particularly women of color or people of color. And I think we need to look deeply at how that plays out day to day and how we might be contributing to that. And Victoria was talking about, you know, what is funded. What is considered research? I mean, if you look at the Boyer model, the Boyer model has been around for what, 25 years now, and it talks about how the gathering and dissemination of knowledge, the creation of knowledge, is one aspect of scholarship, but also scholarship can be those community partnerships that
I turned off the chat. Sorry.
So there's that piece about integration, the working together with other disciplines, other communities to move forward. There's the realm of teaching. There are so many different ways that scholarship can be expressed, yet here in the academy, we're all about have you published and have you published in peer-reviewed journals, as if that's the only way for us to engage in scholarship, and that creates institutional issues. And then the other one is at the individual level. And if you think about the system, you know, the system is comprised of people. And yes, it's the policies, but it's also the way that we uphold and hang on to those policies. It's us as individuals saying, this is how we've always done it. Well, this is how I've learned it. So clearly it's the right thing to learn and the right way to learn it. We in the academy are deeply guilty of elitism and competition. You know, I just had a conversation, I was presenting recently, and I was talking about social determinants of health and, you know, some of our history, and talking about how race is a social construct, and the experience of racism and allostatic load may be the thing that accounts for these disparities that we see of people of color in the United States, that we don't see, by the way, in this giant continent that you may have heard of called Africa. There's a lot of Black people there that do not have the same outcomes as African Americans. And this person like interrupted what I was saying, which is also a form of epistemic exclusion, the amount to which certain people are interrupted and contradicted in a very public way. So that was happening. And he said to me, well, I'm just not sure about the science behind that. I just have never seen an article about that. And I had to ask, so are you telling me that you went to the literature and couldn't find anything? Or are you telling me that you've never looked? And he admitted in that space that he had never looked. But that perspective was shocking to me, that that is a very elitist, that is a very, the world revolves around me, to think that without looking, that things are naturally going to come to your desk if they're valid and true, right? And that is not a very humble way to approach it. And I have to admit that I'm guilty in the academy of thinking that I know more than I may actually know. And I have to be humble and recognize that I am in a constant state of learning, and that we have to be in that space if we're going to move the dialogue forward and we're going to have different sorts of outcomes. I'm just looking at my notes. I had a bunch of things that I wanted to say, and I think that I have said the major points about getting from here to there. So thank you so much, Mercedes.
Thanks, Puri. And we'll move to Dr. Jan. Thank you all, first and foremost, for your patience. We have been hacked in the chat, and so we did have to close down the chat. So we'll just continue to move forward. Thank you so much. Dr. Jan, connecting the dots. You're on mute, Dr. Jan.
I would love to hear questions folks have, just and anything I might respond to that's make sure it's meaningful to you all.
We can have them raise their hand and we can call upon them if anyone has a question.
Comment?
It looks like
Otherwise,
Catherine
I can move.
has a question.
Earlier, we were talking about creating communities of dialogue, and it completely resonates with me, but also worried about having to rely on our BIPOC community to carry that load, to constantly police or correct or do the work. So how do we balance that? How do we make sure that we're in it just as equally, and don't just make our BIPOC communities constantly teach us or correct us?
Thank you, Catherine, for that question. Just as I'd like to just respond for the racial healing circles. Since they're virtual, we are able to have specific circles for our BIPOC community and for our majority community. So that's one thing that we've been able to mitigate in that capacity. Dr. Jan, Puri, Victoria?
First of all, I want to say BIPOC, for those of you who don't know, is Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. So, what can I say? I think that Ava DuVernay said this right after Mr. Floyd was killed. Gayle King was asking her, what if white folks really want to make change? What do you say to them? And Ava DuVernay said, I don't think that that's my job. I think that there are enough educated white folks out there about this issue that they can do their own work. So I have actually talked to a couple of groups that were white that were doing this work. I think that's so important, as much as I think we need to be in diverse communities as well, for all the reasons I said. We're just not going to see our own scripts. Even collectively, we're not going to see our own scripts. So I think that white folks have to take responsibility for that. And there are ways to do it. We're smart people. There are ways to do this, to take the burden off of people of color. I just want to give a shout out in terms of strategy to Toby Marsh, who is a chief nursing officer here at UC Davis Health. And he has mandated that his nurse managers, leaders, take the 3-day training, ARC training that Victoria, Puri, and I have put together, and it's intense 3-day training. And the first group was a nurse executive leadership team. including him, sitting there all 3 days, not answering his phone. So there are ways that we can gather that are very helpful, but I think what you're bringing up is so important, that we need to have different ways to bring these things up. And I would just say, if you're a leader, this is your responsibility to create those communities of dialogue within your unit, to find people to help you to do that, but also to find a way to let your staff be involved in these activities as well. And I just so honor Toby's leadership in that. I've been doing this for 3 decades. I've never seen where a leader says, okay, I really want my frontline nurses trained. They work with patients, but we're going to start with leaders first. And it's going to take a year, but it's going to yield what we need to yield. Because often when you ask people with lesser power to be trained, they come back to their leaders, they're risking a lot in checking the scripts or pointing out the scripts of their leaders. So I think there are creative ways we can create different communities of dialogue is what I want to say. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it was Catherine. Is that who?
Yeah, it was Catherine. In addition to Dr. Henry Tan, our Associate Vice Chancellor for the Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, just launched an IDARE project last Friday, which some of our faculty are online here at this session. Dr. Perry Ackerman Barger is part of that, to where we're building communities within units for these initiatives that need to move forward, specifically to eradicate racism here at the health system. So within the units, there's going to be leadership within there to be able to advance, and then having a larger community, and we're all majority and people of color also, to get proximate, to have these dialogues, to review any policies, any practices, how we're teaching students, how we're teaching our learners. And so slowly but surely we're moving forward in these different ways to build community and have these crucial conversations, these important conversations, to save the lives of the folks we serve. So we are at 12:55 almost, and so we did have a few questions. Moving forward to our panel, opening it up for any last comments for our attendees. And I'll start with Dr. Nago.
Thank you so much for being here. I just noticed a couple of questions, hands up, so I just kind of want to hear those questions. So that's
sure. Our screen is so big, so sorry. So we'll start with Mark. Go ahead,
Hello.
Mark.
I believe it's me. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Very briefly, I was very appreciative of what was said about, I'm in neurology, about the fact that sometimes we're afraid of what we could say that may be offensive. And it is true. It is definitely an important comment. And I think that one of the best recipes for that to help is to engage, to keep the dialogue, to not retract, and to engage and continue to talk, because that's sometimes so refreshing and so helpful and good on both parts, on all parts. Just wanted to say that keep engaging is important.
Yes, Mark. We have to get out of our comfort zones, right? And stay in the uncomfortable. So Tara, you have your hand up.
Hello. I had a question for Dr. Murray Garcia. You mentioned you were teaching a course. And I was wondering if that was a course that you're teaching to undergraduates at UC Davis?
Graduate students, but I'm open to having undergraduates take part in it. It's an intensive that happens only in February. Tuesday, Thursday, we meet for 4 hours at a time just in February. So medical students who want to take it, and we have both, also take an additional afternoon on Monday. But we meet from 1 to 4, and, or I'm sorry, 1 to 5. And when we get into it, we keep leaning into it. Like Dr. Mark says, we need to do that. And we try to establish a safe place. And we resist the script of cancel culture, because that doesn't help anybody. And we try to build on the relationships within the group. Does that answer your question, Terry? Are you an undergraduate or a graduate student?
I recently graduated, but I'm working at the hospital right now. And so I was wondering if that would be something I could take part in.
Let me just say that I would be happy to have you audit, but it can't, in these things like Marilyn and some other folks who've had the training that we've been through, there can't be a coming in and going out. You have to, because the group develops as time goes on. So if you can to Tuesday, Thursday, all of the Tuesday, Thursdays in February for those 4 hours, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you so much.
So with the closing, we're wanting to close at this time. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We are going to continue this dialogue to continue to build our growing as a community. Once again, at UC Davis Health and for the communities we serve, we will have additional sessions this week, and so we will send you that information for you to continue this journey of lifelong learning with us, and as we say, to grow as a community. So thank you for your attending. Thank you, Dr. Jan, Dr. Puri, Dr. Nago, for all of your hard work, and maybe you'll come back later in the year for more information for our community.